The distant wail of an infant pierced through the thin walls of Daryl Quinn's cabin, jolting him from a fitful sleep drenched in memories he'd spent months trying to drown. It wasn't the first night the crying had carried across the short stretch between his property and the newly occupied Watson place, but tonight it seemed to slice deeper into his chest, mingling with his own unspoken grief. Arizona Territory, 1878. Yuma had grown from a dusty outpost to something resembling a proper town over the years Daryl had spent there, though he'd kept himself at its edges, his small ranch just far enough away to avoid neighborly obligations. That had worked fine until the Watson widow had moved into the abandoned homestead neighboring his 2 months ago. Daryl pushed himself upright, his calloused hand scrubbing at 3 days' worth of stubble. The crying continued, accompanied now by what sounded like a woman's soft sobs. He could almost picture her Hannah Newman Watson pacing with the fussing infant, her own tears falling silently as she tried to comfort a child that wouldn't be soothed. He'd seen her in town a handful of times. She kept to herself, much as he did, her eyes always rimmed red, face pale beneath the shade of her bonnet. The townsfolk whispered about her widowed on the journey west, her husband succumbing to fever just days before they reached Yuma. Left alone with a 2-month-old daughter and nowhere to go but the ramshackle property her husband had purchased sight unseen, Daryl swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, unable to bear the duet of misery any longer. Not because it annoyed him, but because it resonated too deeply with something broken inside himself. Something he'd buried alongside his wife and infant son 3 years ago after the influenza had swept through, leaving him hollow and purposeless. Sleep would not return tonight. He lit a lamp and moved to his workshop at the back of the cabin. If he couldn't rest, he might as well be productive. His hands found the half-finished chest of drawers he'd been crafting for the mercantile. But as he reached for his tools, his gaze drifted to the corner where a dust-covered shape lay beneath an old blanket, something he hadn't been able to burn, nor finish. The crying from the neighboring property had quieted, but its echo remained in his mind. With a deep breath that caught painfully in his chest, Daryl crossed the room and pulled away the blanket, revealing the cradle he'd started building when Caroline had told him she was expecting. His fingers traced the smooth oak headboard, the half-completed rockers. He'd abandoned it when there was no longer a child to rock to sleep, when Caroline's delicate hands would never again soothe their son. As the first light of dawn filtered through the small window, Daryl made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The Watson widow needed a proper cradle for her child. And maybe, just maybe, finishing this one would help quiet some of the ghosts that haunted his sleepless nights. The morning was already warm when Daryl approached the Watson property. Hannah was hanging laundry, a faded dress and impossibly small baby clothes fluttering in the breeze. The infant was secured to her chest with what appeared to be a modified shawl, tiny legs dangling as Hannah moved between the clothesline and basket. She spotted him when he was still 20 paces away, her body tensing visibly. Strangers meant trouble more often than not in these parts, and a woman alone had every reason to be cautious. "Mrs. Watson," he called, keeping his distance. "Daryl Quinn, I'm your neighbor to the east." Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied him, one protective hand coming to rest on her baby's back. "Mr. Quinn," she acknowledged with a nod. Up close, she looked even more exhausted than he'd imagined, dark circles beneath eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple knot, strands escaping to frame a face that might have been lovely had it not been so strained with worry and grief. "I heard your little one crying last night," he said, immediately regretting his words when her face flushed with embarrassment. "I apologize if we disturbed you," she replied stiffly. "Harriet has been colicky since." She trailed off, swallowing hard. "No apology needed," Daryl hastened to add. "I wasn't complaining." He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain about his purpose here. I noticed when you arrived that your wagon was pretty loaded down. Did you bring a cradle for the baby? Hannah's face registered surprise at the unexpected question. We had one, but it was damaged crossing the Colorado. She glanced down at her daughter, whose tiny fist was wrapped around a loose strand of her mother's hair. I've been making do with a drawer lined with blankets, but she doesn't seem to settle well in it. Daryl nodded, gathering his courage. I'm a carpenter by trade. I have a cradle I could finish for you. No charge, he added quickly when he saw her stiffen. Pride was sometimes all a person had out here, and he didn't want to wound hers. Why would you do that? Hannah asked, wariness evident in her stance. The truth hovered on his tongue because I built it for my son who never drew breath. Because your crying matches the hollowness in my chest. Because maybe helping you will help me remember how to live, but he couldn't speak those words to this stranger. Being neighborly, he said instead. That's all. Hannah studied him for a long moment, the baby starting to fuss against her chest. I'd be grateful, she finally said, but I insist on paying you when I can. We can discuss that later, Daryl replied, relieved she hadn't turned him away outright. I'll bring it by when it's finished. Shouldn't take more than a day or two. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but Hannah's voice stopped him. Mr. Quinn, would you care for some coffee before you go? It's not much, but… The invitation surprised him. He hadn't sat at anyone's table for a social purpose in years. I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Watson, but I should get back to work. Another time, perhaps. He couldn't miss the flash of disappointment that crossed her face before she nodded in understanding. Something twisted in his chest. Had she been hoping for a few moments of adult conversation to break the lonely silence of her days? I'll bring some fresh venison next time, he found himself offering. Got more than I can eat. The small smile that lifted the corner of her mouth was the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her tired face, hinting at the woman who might exist beneath the grief. I'd like that, Mr. Quinn. Back in his workshop, Daryl uncovered the cradle fully, examining what remained to be done. The basic structure was complete, the headboard and footboard carved with a simple pattern of leaves and vines, the sides joined with perfectly fitted dovetail joints. The rockers needed to be attached, and the whole piece required sanding and oiling. As he worked, memories surfaced that he'd long kept at bay, Caroline sitting by the fire knitting tiny garments. The way she'd laughed when he'd pressed his ear to her swollen belly, eyes widening at the strong kick against his cheek. The plans they'd made, the future they'd imagined. By nightfall, the cradle was taking shape, transformed from a painful reminder to something with purpose. As he carefully sanded each surface until it was satin smooth, Daryl realized he hadn't touched a drop of whiskey all day, the first such day in longer than he could remember. That night, he heard the crying again. But instead of pulling the pillow over his head or reaching for the bottle, he lit his lamp and returned to the workshop, working until his eyes burned and his fingers cramped. When he finally crawled into bed as the first birds began to sing, he slept without dreams for the first time in years. The cradle was finished by midday. Daryl had polished it with beeswax and linseed oil until the wood glowed with a warm honey color. He'd lined it with a soft deerskin he'd tanned himself, something he'd originally intended for moccasins but had never gotten around to using. As a final touch, he'd carved the baby's name Harriet in delicate script across the headboard. He wrapped it carefully in burlap for the short journey to the Watson place, securing it in his wagon alongside a haunch of venison he'd promised. His stomach knotted with an unfamiliar nervousness as he approached the small cabin, wondering if he'd overstepped with the personalized carving. Hannah was outside, attempting to repair a loose board on her porch steps while keeping an eye on Harriet, who lay on a blanket in a patch of shade, waving tiny fists at the air. She straightened when she heard his wagon, pushing a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt across her skin. "Mr. Quinn," she greeted him, setting down her hammer. "You're true to your word." Daryl climbed down from the wagon. "The cradle's finished," he gestured to the wrapped bundle. And I brought that venison I mentioned. Hannah's expression softened with gratitude. You're very kind. Please bring them inside. I just made fresh biscuits, the least I can offer in return. She scooped up Harriet from the blanket, and Daryl found himself looking directly at the infant for the first time. She was small but robust-looking, with a shock of dark hair and her mother's clear blue eyes. Something shifted painfully in his chest as the baby regarded him solemnly before breaking into an unexpected, toothless smile. She likes you, Hannah said quietly. She doesn't smile for just anyone. Daryl couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He nodded and turned back to the wagon, carefully lifting the cradle and following Hannah into the cabin. The interior was spare but meticulously clean. A cooking area dominated one corner, a small table with two mismatched chairs in another. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, and beside it, Daryl could see the drawer lined with blankets that served as Harriet's makeshift bed. You can set it there, Hannah directed, indicating a spot near her own bed. Would you like to see if she approves of her new sleeping place? Before Daryl could answer, Hannah was unwrapping the burlap, her sharp intake of breath telling him she was pleased with what she found. Her fingers traced the carved pattern, lingering on her daughter's name. Mr. Quinn, it's beautiful. Her eyes, when they met his, were bright with unshed tears. Far too fine for no payment. Please, he said gruffly, it needed to be finished. He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone must have warned her not to press. Hannah gently laid Harriet in the cradle, the baby looking even smaller against the deerskin lining. For a moment, the infant's face scrunched as if preparing to cry, but then she seemed to settle, her eyelids growing heavy as Hannah rocked the cradle gently with one hand. I think she approves, Hannah whispered, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Thank you, truly. They shared a quiet meal of biscuits and coffee. The conversation initially awkward but gradually easing as they discussed practical matters, the well that needed deepening on Hannah's property, the best place to plant a kitchen garden, the temperamental weather patterns of the Arizona territory. How did you come to be in Yuma? Hannah asked as she refilled his coffee cup. You don't strike me as someone who was born here. Daryl contemplated his answer, surprised to find himself willing to share even a piece of his story. Originally from Missouri. Came west after the war looking for a fresh start. Found work as a carpenter, saved enough to buy my land about 5 years ago. He paused, then added, my wife Caroline and I. Hannah's eyes softened with understanding. And Mrs. Quinn is? Gone, Daryl said simply. 3 years now. Influenza. Hannah reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching the back of his hand in a gesture of silent sympathy. I'm sorry, it's a particular kind of loneliness, isn't it? Being left behind. The perceptiveness of her observation caught him off guard. He nodded, not trusting his voice. James, my husband, he had such dreams for this place, Hannah continued, her gaze drifting to the window. He talked of orchards and horses, a proper farm where we could raise our children. She smiled sadly. I didn't have the heart to tell him I know nothing about farming. I was a schoolteacher back in Ohio. You teach reading and writing? Daryl asked. Hannah nodded. And arithmetic, history, a bit of science. Yuma could use a proper teacher, he said thoughtfully. The children here get a haphazard education at best. Might be a way for you to earn a steadier income than trying to work this land alone. A spark of interest lit Hannah's eyes. Do you really think there would be interest? I know a few families who jump at the chance for their children to learn from a trained teacher, Daryl replied. I could ask around if you'd like. I would be grateful, Hannah said. Very grateful indeed. As he prepared to leave, Hannah insisted on sending him home with a bundle of fresh biscuits. A poor exchange for such a beautiful cradle, she said, but it's what I can offer today. Daryl accepted the wrapped cloth. The cradle needed a child to rock in it, he said quietly. That's payment enough. That night, for the first time since he'd become aware of his neighbors, there was no crying from the Watson place. Daryl lay in his bed, the silence both a relief and strangely empty. He wondered if Hannah was sleeping peacefully too, the burden of endless walking and rocking eased by the cradle's gentle motion. The next week passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Daryl spoke with families in town about Hannah's teaching experience. The response was enthusiastic, especially from mothers who wanted more for their daughters than the limited futures they themselves had faced. By the end of the week, arrangements had been made for Hannah to begin teaching in a vacant storefront 3 days a week, with each family contributing what they could to her salary. He delivered the news to Hannah on a Sunday afternoon, finding her hanging laundry again, Harriet secured in a sling across her chest. The baby had grown noticeably in just the short time since he'd last seen them, her cheeks fuller, her eyes more alert. "Mr. Quinn." Hannah greeted him with a warm smile that transformed her entire face. She looked different, still tired, certainly, but with a spark of energy that had been absent before. "What brings you by today?" "Good news," he replied, unable to keep from returning her smile. "You've got yourself a teaching position if you want it. 15 children to start, ages 5 to 14, 3 days a week." Hannah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Already? How did you manage that so quickly?" "Turns out I wasn't the only one who thought Yuma could use a proper teacher," Daryl explained. "Word spread, and here we are. They're offering $8 a week to start." Hannah's free hand flew to her mouth. $8, that's more than I made back in Ohio for a full week of teaching. Skilled labor is valued out here, Daryl said simply. "When can you start?" "Next week," Hannah suggested, excitement coloring her voice. "I'll need to prepare lessons and figure out what to do with Harriet while I'm teaching." "Mrs. Holloway, the blacksmith's wife, offered to mind her," Daryl said. "She has a little one about the same age." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, but they were different from the ones of grief and exhaustion he'd seen before. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," he assured her. "Just doing what neighbors do." The look she gave him suggested she knew it was more than that, but she didn't press him. Instead, she invited him to stay for supper, a proper meal this time, she promised. With some of the venison he'd brought stewed with wild onions and the first tender greens of spring. As the weeks passed, a rhythm developed between them. Daryl would help Hannah with repairs around her property in exchange for meals. Sometimes he'd mind Harriet while Hannah attended to chores that required both hands. The baby had taken an inexplicable liking to him, quieting immediately whenever he held her, her tiny fingers often curling around one of his rough digits with surprising strength. Hannah flourished in her role as Yuma's teacher. Color returned to her cheeks, and though she still spoke of James with fondness and grief, the constant crying that had marked her first months in Yuma subsided. She made friends among the town's women, particularly Mrs. Holloway, whose warmth and practical nature complemented Hannah's more reserved personality. It was Mrs. Holloway who first commented on the change in Daryl Quinn. "You've brought that man back to life," she told Hannah one afternoon as they watched their babies nap side by side. "Before you came, he hardly spoke 2 words to anyone unless it was about business. Now look at him fixing your roof, carrying your marketing, smiling like he remembers how to feel something besides misery." Hannah had blushed and denied any special influence, but privately, she'd begun to wonder about the quiet carpenter who'd become such a steady presence in her and Harriet's lives. There was a gentleness beneath his weathered exterior that touched her deeply, the way he handled Harriet with such care. How he always brought small treasures for the baby. A carved wooden rattle, a soft rabbit pelt for her to touch, wildflowers arranged in a jar for Hannah's table. One evening in early summer, as they sat on Hannah's newly repaired porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Daryl finally told her the full truth about the cradle. "I started building it when Caroline told me she was expecting," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "We'd been trying for years with no luck, and then suddenly it was happening. I worked on that cradle every evening, wanting it to be perfect." Hannah listened silently, her heart aching for the pain evident in every line of his body. The influenza came through just as she was nearing her time, he continued. She fought so hard, but she was already weakened from the pregnancy. She died with our son still inside her. His voice broke. They're buried together on the rise behind my cabin where the wildflowers grow thickest in spring. Hannah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. So that's why you couldn't finish it, she whispered. Daryl nodded. Couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't bring myself to burn it, just covered it up and tried to forget. He turned to meet her gaze. Until I heard you and Harriet crying night after night, it was like hearing my own grief given voice. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. James died of fever 4 days before we reached Yuma. I was alone in the back of the wagon with a newborn, no idea how to manage on my own, terrified Harriet would die too. She squeezed his hand. Those first weeks here, I thought I might lose my mind from grief and exhaustion. And then you appeared with that beautiful cradle, and for the first time I slept through the night. We're quite the pair, aren't we? Daryl said with a sad smile. Broken pieces trying to make something whole. Hannah looked at him thoughtfully. Perhaps that's what healing looks like, Daryl. Not returning to what was before, but building something new from what remains. The use of his first name didn't escape him, nor did the warmth that spread through his chest at hearing it from her lips. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, neither feeling the need to fill the air with words. As summer gave way to autumn, their relationship deepened beyond mere friendship. Daryl found himself looking for excuses to visit the Watson place, bringing small gifts for Harriet and practical offerings for Hannah, a bolt of fabric he thought would suit her coloring, seeds for the kitchen garden they'd planted together, books for her classroom borrowed from the circuit judge who passed through Yuma every few months. For her part, Hannah began to understand that what she felt for Daryl was more than gratitude or the comfort of companionship. She found herself watching for him from her classroom window, her heart lightening when she spotted his tall figure making his way down Yuma's dusty Main Street. She took special care with meals when he joined them, noting which dishes he particularly enjoyed. She even asked Mrs. Holloway to mind Harriet one Saturday so she could visit Daryl's workshop, bringing a picnic lunch as her excuse. The workshop had impressed her deeply, not just the quality of the furniture in various stages of completion, but the evidence of Daryl's artistic soul in the detailed carvings and perfect proportions of each piece. She'd run her fingers over a bureau destined for the banker's new house, marveling at the smooth finish and intricate inlay work. "You're more than a carpenter," she'd told him. "You're an artist." He'd flushed at the compliment, unused to such praise, but the pleasure in his eyes had been unmistakable. It was Harriet who ultimately pushed their relationship forward. At 8 months old, she was sitting up, babbling constantly, and had developed a distinct personality, sunny and determined, with a laugh that could melt the hardest heart. She'd also formed a powerful attachment to Daryl, often lunging toward him from Hannah's arms the moment he appeared. One October evening, as Hannah was preparing supper while Daryl entertained Harriet on the cabin floor, the baby pulled herself up using his knee for support, took 2 wobbly steps toward a wooden horse he'd carved for her, and clearly said, "Da da," before plopping back down on her bottom. The room went still, Hannah frozen at the stove, Daryl's face a complex mixture of emotions. Harriet, oblivious to the impact of her linguistic milestone, repeated "da da" happily, reaching for the toy horse. "I'm sorry," Hannah said quietly. "She doesn't understand, no need to apologize," Daryl interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. He looked up at Hannah, his eyes asking a question he couldn't yet voice. Hannah set down the spoon she'd been holding and crossed the room, kneeling beside them on the floor. "Harriet has good instincts," she said softly. "She knows a father's heart when she sees one." Daryl reached out, his hand cupping Hannah's cheek with infinite tenderness. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Hannah leaned into his touch. I'm saying that Harriet and I both have grown to love you, Daryl Quinn. That you brought light back into our lives when all seemed dark. That if you wanted to be her father in more than just her baby pronunciation, I would be the happiest woman in the Arizona territory. Hannah, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. I never thought I'd feel this way again, never thought I'd want to, but you and this little one. He glanced down at Harriet, who was contentedly gumming the wooden horse. You've given me a reason to wake up in the morning. A future to look toward instead of a past to mourn. Is that a yes? Hannah asked, her heart thundering in her chest. It's more than a yes, Daryl replied, leaning forward to press his forehead against hers. It's a promise. To love you both, to protect you, to build a life together for as long as I draw breath. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a bridge between the grief they'd each carried and the joy they'd found in each other. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. Da. Harriet announced again, apparently approving of this development. They were married 2 weeks later in Yuma's small church, with Harriet balanced on Mrs. Holloway's hip, babbling excitedly throughout the brief ceremony. Hannah wore a new dress of deep blue calico that Daryl had insisted on buying for her from the mercantile's finest stock. He'd shaved his beard and donned a new shirt for the occasion, looking younger and unburdened in a way Hannah had never seen him. The town turned out in surprising numbers for the celebration, many bringing dishes for the wedding supper and small gifts for the new family. Hannah's students presented her with a quilt they'd secretly made under Mrs. Holloway's guidance, each child contributing a square decorated with embroidered symbols of their teacher's impact on their lives: books, slates, wildflowers, even a surprisingly accurate rendition of Harriet. As Daryl watched his new wife accepting congratulations, Harriet now asleep against his shoulder after the excitement of the day, he marveled at how his life had transformed in the span of 6 months. From isolated grief to a family, from emptiness to purpose. The cradle he'd built in sorrow now rocked a child he loved as his own, and the woman who'd cried through so many nights now smiled at him with such tenderness, it made his chest ache with joy rather than pain. That night, after they'd settled Harriet in her cradle in the small room Daryl had added to his cabin specifically for her, husband and wife found each other with a passion born of deep emotional connection, rather than mere physical desire. Their coming together was a healing, a celebration, a promise of the future they would build together. You believe in fate? Hannah asked later, her head resting on Daryl's chest as they lay entwined beneath the quilts. That some things, no matter how painful the journey, are meant to be. Daryl's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. I never did before. Always figured life was just a series of happenings, good and bad, with no particular pattern. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. But now, I have to wonder if all the loss and heartache wasn't leading us to find each other, to create this family that might never have existed otherwise. I think James and Caroline would approve, don't you? Hannah asked softly. They wouldn't want us to mourn forever. No, Daryl agreed. They'd want us to live fully, to love openly, to raise Harriet with joy. He hesitated, then added, and perhaps give her siblings in time. Hannah rose up on one elbow, her hair falling like a curtain around them. I'd like that very much, she whispered before leaning down to kiss him. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it wildflowers that carpeted the desert in unexpected bursts of color. Daryl planted the orchard that James had dreamed of, apple and peach trees that would take years to bear fruit, but represented their commitment to this place and each other. Hannah continued teaching, her classroom now housed in a proper schoolhouse that the town had built during the winter months, with Daryl designing the furniture and supervising the construction. Harriet thrived, walking confidently now and developing a vocabulary that impressed even the most experienced parents in town. She called Daryl Papa, now a deliberate choice Hannah had made to honor both the man who'd given Harriet life and the one who was raising her with such devotion. On a particularly beautiful April morning, Hannah placed Daryl's hand on her still flat stomach, her eyes shining with happy tears. "It seems Harriet will be a big sister by Christmas," she told him. Daryl's joy was tempered with a flash of fear. Memories of Caroline's fate momentarily darkening his expression, but Hannah understood without words. "I'm strong," she assured him. "And we have Dr. Mitchell now and Mrs. Holloway, who's delivered half the babies in the county. All will be well, my love." That evening, as Harriet slept soundly in her cradle, the same one that had once symbolized so much loss, but now represented hope and new beginnings, Daryl began sketching plans for a larger cradle that would rock their growing family into the future. As his pencil moved across the paper, Hannah's arms encircled him from behind, her cheek resting against his shoulder. "Another masterpiece in the making?" she asked. Daryl covered her hands with his own. "Just like our life together," he replied. "Built with care, made to last, more beautiful for having weathered the storms that came before." Outside their window, the desert bloomed in defiance of its harsh reputation, much like the love that had grown between a grieving carpenter and a widow who couldn't stop crying until he gave her a reason to smile again.